The Joyful Friar podcast is made possible by the generous support of our friends. To support the podcast, please visit nathan-castle.com and donate today. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm Father Nathan, your host, joined today by my assistant, Toto, the canine face of God. I'm out of uniform. I'm usually wearing my Dominican habit when I do a podcast, but I'm over at my friend's house, Toto's owner, his master, his friend, and we're about to play golf in a little while, but I've got just enough time to share this podcast with you. This one is a story that goes back 5 years. So for me, it's a little bit down memory lane and a very happy trip because I'm going to be talking with you about uh, a fellow, what he called a man of the cloth. He was a country pastor of a small congregation that had Baptist in its name, but did not belong to a Southern Baptist convention or any other denominational grouping. It just had the name Baptist in it, but it was independent. Um, this story came to us in, uh, I think it was March of 2020, which was right when the pandemic was starting, if you remember. But in the dream that he chose to show me, uh, there was a man in a stream, a river, who was drowning, and he was holding on to a piece of wood. He was about to go into a culvert that must have gone under the road nearby, and I awoke. Well, when we went into prayer about it, it turned out that we're not using his proper name. Uh, he ended up deciding to use the name John to conceal his identity for reasons that'll become clear. Um, he really loved being this small country pastor. The thing he said, we were a small church, and because we were small in number, we didn't very often have a baptism. But once in a while, when they did, they would plan ahead and they would say to everyone, next Sunday, don't come to church, come to the river. And that everybody in the congregation knew what that meant. There was a place where there was a clearing next to a river. I guess the river was, appropriate for baptizing. Maybe, slow moving enough as to not carry people away. Maybe shallow enough that they could stand in it. There was a clearing where they could park their cars and trucks. And he said after the baptism and the service, we would have a picnic. And looking back at his life, he said were some of his happiest moments ever. Well, of course, he died in a sudden and tragic way, but it was unclear to me what that was. All I saw was what I told you, the dream that he showed of a man floating and about to go into a culvert where it looked like he would die. Well, he explained to us that he and his wife had married young. He said, we learned about sex with each other. We're the only people we ever dated. They had at least two kids. He mentioned kids plural, and they were just living their lives, going about their business. He was invited by a man who sometimes came to church by himself. He was asked by the man if he could counsel with him, if he could talk with him privately, and could they meet down by the river. So they did that. They each came in their trucks. He said, we didn't even sit down. We were just leaning against our trucks, talking across the way to one another, and kind of breaking the ice. And he said that's the way sometimes people do when they have some personal counsel that they want. And then he said the man told me he had something in the back of his truck that he wanted me to see, and so would I come over and take a look? So he did, and he came over and took a look, and the man hit him, didn't knock him out, but dazed him, he said. He had a rope, and he tied him up, put him in the river and drown him. And then as he was drowning or something, he had some piece of a board that had once been a door. It had a hole in it that he could make the man look like he was clinging to. I guess he was trying to make it look like accidental drowning somehow and not an intentional act. Anyway, that's what he described. And he said, when all this was going on, I had no idea why this was all happening. He mentioned that he said, I saw myself out of body. I was above and I was looking down at my body in the river and I thought, that's how I'm going to die. And in fact, he did. He explained to us that after leaving his body, that what he remembers is being groggy, and that it was something like maybe an experience when you've been ill, where you sleep more than normal and wake up for a short time, and someone's there to comfort you or give you a sip of water or something, assure you that you're okay. He would fall back to sleep. He said, I stayed in a groggy state for some time like that. And then there came a point where it was explained to him, if it wasn't clear already, that he had indeed died, but that he was in the afterlife and he was being very well taken care of and he could relax. So he accepted that as being the truth. He began to wonder and speculate about his experience of having died because he was a preacher and he used to teach people about what would happen after you die. He had a particular Christian hymn that's popular in evangelical Protestant churches, uh, leaning on the everlasting arms, or being, it had the idea of being carried by Jesus through tough times, the everlasting arms. And he had in mind that when a person who was a believer in Jesus would die, that Jesus would be the first person they'd see. He would pick them up and carry them. So that was in his imagination, and it's what he taught people. So he was wondering, how come that hasn't happened? I'm here in this place and there's all these people, but when am I going to see Jesus? Well, one of the people helping him said, well, do you remember the Holy Spirit? Do you remember that in the Jesus stories after he died, um, the people had to get used to seeing him in each other because of the Holy Spirit? That he now looked like all these other people because he was inside them. And he said, of course, I remember that. It just wasn't the way I was thinking. And he said, it's like they had to take me back to Christian preschool and teach me all over again. He did say that they also said to him, well, that other idea that you have about seeing Jesus as he's depicted often in artwork with a toga and sandals and a beard, he said, if you want to see that version of him, we'll get you ready for that. It's just not yet. Well, he had a lot on his plate because, as it turned out, the reason that he was killed is because the man who killed him was carrying on an affair with the pastor's wife. When he learned that, he said, I wasn't angry, just confused and stunned. He said, I had no idea that my wife was ever unfaithful to me. It never occurred to me. And he said, even now, there's a betrayal about that, but they've been telling me that I'm not quite yet ready to deal with that. Let's kind of table that for a while you get a little better acclimated to your new way of life. And he thought that was wise. He was also protective of his and her privacy. He even said something like, people sometimes get carried away by events. He was already kind of accepting of both of them, of his wife and this man who killed him. Um, but he said, I really haven't gone into that in any level of depth yet, and they keep telling me it's not quite time, but we'll get to that soon. So he was okay with that. Very wise man, I thought, and he spared himself a lot of grief in the afterlife by not being outraged and infuriated at having been deceived and murdered. He even he was very much a follower of Jesus, and he said, he came to a very violent end, and he was betrayed by the people closest to him. But it took only 3 days for it to turn. He said, I was a man who preached good news, and I want my story to be good news, even though it ended the way that it did. But it didn't end because I'm here and I'm still me, and I have a life after that. And he said, I want to be good news. And he remembered that what Jesus said to people who had betrayed him when he came up to them or appeared to them after Easter, you know, First thing he said was, "Peace be with you." He didn't wait for any apologies. He didn't discriminate about who he would forgive and who he wouldn't. He just said, "Peace be with you" to anybody he encountered. And he said, "I want to be like that." How about that? Lots of times, clergy folk and religious people, we come across poorly to the rest of the world as smug or um, arrogant, um, holier than thou. And when we do that, we're not we're not we're not very effective followers of Jesus or preachers of good news. My order is called the Order of Preachers, and I was reminded that sometimes in popular parlance, preaching is a pejorative, a negative. Don't preach at me. Well, I was also told that before you try to speak the good news, you must embody the good news. It needs to be in you, it needs to be in the fabric of you. And then when it comes out of you vocally, it has integrity. There's a way in which it all belongs. Well, I believe that this man who we're calling John the Baptist has that integrity really deeply. I think as we go into his story more deeply, it took two conversations with him later to get his permission to use his story, and it just barely got included in book two because we had a deadline. Um, but he was very careful about it. He said, not very many people die in the circumstance that I did. My congregation was small. It might be that nobody ever hears of this. My death was a crime, but it was one that went undiscovered. And he said, "I'm not interested in reopening that." Uh, he was cautious about whether he should say yes to this story becoming public. My sister Catherine helped with those conversations, and in it, we're going to share a lot of that in the next two episodes of this podcast. He was cautious because he didn't want to hurt anybody. He didn't want to shock, and he didn't want this to be about an unsolved crime. So he sought advice in the afterlife, which to me is a sign of wisdom. People who know it all don't seek advice, and they're usually diminished for it because when we don't seek advice of wise people, we impoverish ourselves. And sometimes the reason we don't is because we already think we know all we need to know. He had been raised sort of like that. He told he told us that when he learned that I was not only a man of the cloth but a Catholic priest, he thought, that's funny because he probably would have never gotten to know me because he was taught to be mistrustful of Catholics. They go on about their statues and such, he said. He also was told that ecumenical activities among ministers was nonsense. It was a waste of time. All they did was write papers that nobody read. They had luncheons, and somebody got a job doing he didn't know what. That ecumenical stuff was just a waste of time. He said, there were those jokes about Baptist heaven or Catholic heaven or Pentecostal heaven. And he said, I'm meeting all kinds of people now. And he also said, I'm meeting people. He mentioned that he knew that there was a Muslim man who died while praying that was in one of my books. And he said, he's right here near me. We haven't talked yet, but we will. And he said, it's like before the Tower of Babel story when everybody spoke the common language. Here, all you have to do is form your thoughts and it comes out in a way that everybody understands. So he was already in his early afterlife stage as he moved from this grogginess into more wakefulness and clearer understanding of what was around him. He was really marveling that the world was larger and more, I don't know, inclusive than he had been taught to believe. He said, it's right there in the stories that Jesus was always mixing with people that the religious ones thought he shouldn't. He would be healing a Roman centurion servant, or he would uh, touch the woman you weren't supposed to touch, or go to Samaria where you're supposed to hate those kind of people. He compared it to like a junior high cafeteria and said, we get used to early on in our lives only associating with our own kind, whatever we think that is. And he said, I was no different than anybody else that way. I wish now that I had been more about pushing my congregation in particular to being better at boundary breaking because that was Jesus's way of life. Anyway, he was enjoying that aspect of the his early experience of his afterlife, that it was uh, it was inclusive of lots of other kinds of people, and he enjoyed all of them. And he thought that, and he also thought, he looked back at the earth and he thought, it's more beautiful than I ever thought. He had an idea that when you left the earth and went on to heaven, that heaven would be so full of glories, there wouldn't be anything on earth that would ever interest you ever again, because it would be too pale or insignificant. And he said, but the scriptures also said that the earth is full of the goodness of the Lord. And now when I look at the earth and its people, I see so much more beauty than I did before. Isn't that nice? You might just take that to heart and go, you know, uh, Holy Spirit, how can you help me see the beauty that's right before me? That might be a way that sends you in a better and happier direction. Well, in the way that we do these stories, we first tell the story. The second one in the trilogy is compassionate response to that story. What does it evoke in us that makes us be with this person in suffering? How can we be with uh, this man who was taking the name John the Baptist? And then the third part of the trilogy is a spiritual practice, something that derives or emanates from this person's story that can send us into a spiritual practice, a prayer practice, a different way of thinking, something that might benefit us. So this will be really rich, I think. It happens that I'm recording this session on April Fool's Day, April 1st of 2025. It's my anniversary. I was baptized on this day in 1956. So 69 years ago, little, I wasn't called Nathan at the time. I was Robert Gerard. I was a difficult birth, and my mom prayed to Saint Gerard, the patron of pregnant women in difficult circumstances. Gerard had been, I think it was Paris, where prostitutes who got pregnant were left on the streets to fend for themselves, and he collected them up and helped them be safe and give birth to their babies. And he ended up engaging other people in that work and becoming known as the patron of pregnant women in difficult circumstances. Well, my mom was in a difficult circumstance in that she was 35, had two kids, and a prior miscarriage, and was carrying me breech, and they couldn't get me to turn. And so there was a question of that, whether it would be a C-section or whether I'd be breech born. And they opted for that. I remember at my 25th anniversary of priesthood, she stood up and said, "Oh, I remember that day very well." In fact, it was like a day and a half of difficult labor, but I did make it here safely. And then she also named me after the pediatrician, Robert. So I was Robert Gerard. I took Nathan as a religious name when I joined the Dominicans many years later. But anyway, it's my anniversary of my baptism today. And the timing of this, because we do it over a 3-week period, will bring us through the end of Lent into Holy Week. And the last episode in this trilogy will air on Tuesday of Easter week, right when we're hearing the first afterlife stories of the crucified, died, and now risen Jesus showing up to people and saying to them, "Peace be with you." So I wish that for you. And I especially wish that if you're going through any kind of turmoil or heartache, that you might find some comfort in this trilogy and in this person. John the Baptist is a man of faith who is interested in spiritual leadership, and that hasn't stopped. He can still do that from where he is across the veil. He might be a prayer partner of yours if you asked him to be. So it looks like we're boring our little friend here. Okay, ready to say goodbye? We're going to end this podcast right here. Remember that if you'd like to be in touch with me, I can be found at my website, nathan-castle.com. I ask that if you have a question for me about the method of what we do, please have read at least one of the books first, because a lot of that can be explained. And if we do have a conversation, it might be richer because we'll have more of a starting point. Remember, too, that I pray for you regularly. I ask the Holy Spirit among the listeners and viewers of the podcast. I'd like to ask healing for anybody who has some hidden wound or some confounding issue in their life that's painful. That's where I ask that my prayers would go as a kind of a healing ointment. So I'm praying that for you. So anyway, that's this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm Father Nathan Castle on my way to the golf course. God bless you. Have a great day.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Joyful Friar. Please like, follow, and subscribe. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. God bless.